While we'll be starting with a lighter example, as we go on, some of the hermits on this list will become increasingly dark, so viewer discretion is advised. After all, while many hermits are voluntary, some have factors working against them that make their stories very tragic. We'd also suggest sticking around till the very end, as our last story will be a modern tale about how a certain type of hermit now makes up about 1% of an entire country's population. Let's face it, anyone who decides to isolate themselves for years on end is probably pretty strange. Yet, for one reason or another, throughout history, there are several examples of people who have done just that. Their stories and the circumstances surrounding their solitude provide us with a fascinating look into the human psyche. So today, get ready to hear about the stranger side of humanity as we share the stories of the weirdest hermits in history. But before we begin, if you're fascinated in history, you may also be interested in providing us with a little bit of extra support. If you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Generally speaking, those with the means to live a comfortable life will opt to do so, but not George Lucas. Not that George Lucas. Despite being born to a wealthy landowning family in England and becoming educated as a doctor, in 1849, he decided to become a complete recluse after the death of his mother. In what can only be described as an extreme bout of paranoia, he refused to trust any of his relatives, instead opting to barricade himself alone inside the family home. He lived inside the kitchen, slept on a bed of ashes and soot, never went outside, never cleaned himself, and let his hair grow to waist length. While inside, he wore nothing more than a blanket fastened with a wooden skewer, and always had a shotgun at his side. In order to sustain himself, he hired 2 watchmen who not only protected the home, but also delivered to him a grocery list that consisted of bread, milk, cheese, eggs, red herring, and gin. He lived in this state for 25 years, and all the while, his house fell into disrepair. However, despite his solitude, Lucas actually did enjoy talking with others. From a barred window, the so-called Hermit of Hertfordshire would speak to anyone who came to visit, and became famous for giving out candy and money to children at Christmas time. Over time, well-educated people began to come by, with even the famed Charles Dickens paying him a visit and writing a story about the experience. According to most reports, he was actually a very good conversationalist. However, all of those conversations ended when on April 21st of 1874, police forced their way onto the property after he failed to respond to a postman at his door. It was there that they found a barely conscious Lucas suffering from a stroke, and although he was taken to a hospital, he died later that day. When police looked around the house, they found that every door and window had been barricaded with thick planks of wood. They also found that he had left a fortune of £120,000, which would be the modern equivalent of about £17.4 million, or $22 million. Of all the hermits out there, the one that may just be the most famous was Pope Celestine X. Celestine X started life out as Pietro Angelario. Hailing from a poor family in the region of Molise in central Italy, Pietro became a Benedictine monk at the age of 17 and quickly developed a reputation for his desire to live a life that was as minimal as possible. As a result, he moved to a retreat in the mountains at the age of 24 and remained there in near complete solitude until the age of 29, when he decided to go to a similar cave that was even more remote alongside 2 companions. While living this way, he founded the Celestines, who were an order of monks that lived in a way similar to that of Pietro Angelario. The crazy part about Pietro's life is that his quiet solitude caused him to, rather ironically, be forcibly elected to an extremely social position. That's because after prophesying that the cardinals of the church would receive divine punishment for not electing a pope after 2 years of deliberations, the cardinals all heard of his prophecy, felt bad, and suddenly agreed to just make Pietro the pope. At first, Pietro ardently refused the role. However, after being convinced by a group of cardinals and a couple of kings to assume the role, he was installed under the name Celestine V. As you might expect, the hermit pope would go on to jump from disaster to disaster. Choosing to stay in Naples rather than Rome, he became one of the weakest popes of all time, submitting almost entirely to the will of the King of Naples, appointing practically everyone that the king recommended for church positions. He was so disorganized that he would sometimes elect one person to multiple positions, which was in clear violation to standard church practice. Recognizing his downfalls, after just 5 months and 8 days, he announced his resignation and signaled his desire to return to a hermetic life. However, this was not to be. Many factions were firmly against his resignation, and fearing that someone may try to install him as an anti-pope, the new pope promptly locked him up in a prison cell in Rome. It was here that he would go on to pass away after 10 months in captivity at the age of 81. While most of the hermits on this list acted alone, there is one fascinating example from history of a family that hid away as hermits for more than 4 decades. The family in question were the Lykovs, who were a group of 6 that were part of a religious sect of Orthodox Christians known as the Old Believers. While more or less tolerated by central authorities for years, when the Soviet Union rose to power, they were not a fan of religion in general and had especially low tolerance for religious minorities like the Old Believers. As a result, the USSR began to persecute Old Believers, arresting and even slaughtering many under the charge of being anti-communist. This caused many to flee, and in the case of the Lykovs, in 1936, they decided to pack their things and escape to the wilderness of Siberia. Once there, they settled on the otherwise uninhabited Abakan Ridge, where they lived in almost complete isolation inside a small wooden hut. Their living conditions were, to put it mildly, absolutely abysmal. Facing constant battles with the brutal cold, they survived by eating roots, grass, mushrooms, potatoes, and bark. Due to their lack of hunting equipment, they would very rarely eat meat, and things really got to a head in 1961, when the Lykov matriarch, Akulina, died of hunger so that her children could survive. Despite this terrible event, the Lykovs continued on, and ended up staying in the hut for 42 years, only re-emerging in 1978 after being discovered by Soviet geologists. From there, the family would go on to learn about the outside world. Yet, under unfortunate circumstances, 3 of the 4 children died within a few days of each other in 1981, while the Lykov patriarch, Karp, passed away in 1988. However, to this day, a daughter by the name of Agafia is still alive and well. While given the opportunity to leave the hut, for years she opted to stay. But in a strange twist of events, she was able to find a companion. For a period of 18 years between 1997 and 2015, Yerofey Sedov, who was one of the Soviet geologists who discovered her family in 1978, lived in a hut beside her. Yet, after passing away in 2015, Agafia was once again all alone in her ramshackle abode. However, in 2021, Agafia finally moved out after Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska built her a simple but beautiful 1-story hut in a remote area of the western Cheyenne Mountains. It is here that she continues to live in remote but far better conditions. It's also worth noting that there are some historical hermits that did things that were a little extreme. One of these extreme hermits was a Syrian man by the name of Simeon Stylites, who against all odds lived on a platform atop a pillar for a mind-boggling 37 years. Born the son of a shepherd, Simeon entered a monastery at age 16, but was so extreme that his fellow monks asked him to leave. In response, he shut himself in a hut for 18 months, and after that, he chose to live in a narrow crack in Sheikh Bakarat mountain. Unwittingly, his extreme way of life made him quite the celebrity, and he was so famous that crowds of pilgrims invaded the area, constantly asking him for prayers and advice. Fed up, Simeon went to the extreme. After finding a pillar among some ruins, he created a small platform and climbed up. While he started with a 2-meter tall pillar, he eventually moved to a 15-meter tall one, and it is atop this precipice that he spent his days and nights. For sustenance, locals would give him parcels of flatbread and goat's milk, and while he spent most of his time in prayer, every afternoon he would receive visitors. He soon became known for his sound and, rather surprisingly, compassionate and non-extreme advice. Over time, his exploits got the attention of Emperors Theodosius II and Leo, who both sought him out for counsel. This type of publicity, in turn, further increased his fame, and soon enough, many others began to follow his example. And while Simeon would die atop his pillar after 37 years of devotion, the trend he set did not die out with him, as pillar hermits became a common phenomenon for centuries after his death, and at least one by the name of Maxim Kavtaradze continues this practice today. Now we bounce it back to you. Which one of these stories did you think were the most interesting? And did we miss any that you would have liked to see in this video? We'd love to hear what you guys have to say, so let us know in the comments down below. And of course, if you'd like more videos about the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments.